And welcome everyone. We're excited to be hosting a virtual town hall with Iowa Representative Mariannette Miller-Meeks. She recently became chair of the House Conservative Climate Caucus, and so we're all here today to sort of get to know her a little bit better. My name is Angela, and I'm republicEn's engagement director. We are an organization building community for conservatives who care about climate change and want to take action. In a little bit, we're going to have a Q&A session, starting off with questions from the republicEn team and then opening the floor for questions from our guests. We do ask that you type questions and comments in the chat, and we'll field those to Representative Miller-Meeks. So now, without further ado, I turn the mic over to our Executive Director and former Congressman, Bob Inglis.
Thanks, Angela, and thank you all for joining us. This is a pretty exciting thing to have Representative Mariannette Miller-Meeks join us. I think she's going to join us in just a few minutes, and I want to make sure she hears all that I say about her. But before I get to saying about that remarkable career that she's had, let me just say this. Mariannette Miller-Meeks is taking over for John Curtis as the chair of the Conservative Climate Caucus in the House. If you had told me when I was getting tossed out of Congress in 2010, among other heresies, for the biggest heresy of saying that climate change is real and let's do something about it, that there would be a conservative climate caucus someday that had over 80 members, I would have told you you were nuts. And so turns out that's exactly what John Curtis was able to do with the help of people like Representative Miller-Meeks. And so now, as you probably know, John Curtis is running for the Senate, so he'll be leaving the House, and he has handed over the reins of the Conservative Climate Caucus to our guest today, Mariannette Miller-Meeks. And so it's pretty remarkable that there would be 80 House Republicans on the Conservative Climate Caucus. As you'll hear when I'm talking about when Representative Miller-Meeks joins us, you'll hear why I think we're in such good hands as she takes over the helm for John. For those of you who are just joining us, we're waiting now for Representative Miller-Meeks to join us. And when she does, I'll be introducing her. In the meantime,
she's here, Bob.
She's here?
Yep.
Oh, hello.
Hello. I got to hear all the great stuff you said about me, and I was thinking, okay, Representative Inglis is delusional. That's
No, let me tell you, I just said
why he's no longer in Congress.
When I saw you not too long ago in your office, I commented on this amazing plaque that's on your door. And you all got to know this. Our guest here today, Representative Miller-Meeks, enlisted in the Army at age 18. Have I got that right, Mariannette? Yes, at 18. Became a nurse, became an ophthalmologist, became a lieutenant colonel, then ran for Congress, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And then won finally in 2020. Now, I tell you what, when I was just describing the Conservative Climate Caucus being in good hands, tell me if those aren't good hands. I mean, really, it is remarkable to enlist in the Army at 18, end up being a colonel and an ophthalmologist. This is just pretty amazing. And then not get discouraged in 3 unsuccessful runs, but then finally make it on the 4th. Really remarkable. So, Mariannette, maybe now you should say, okay, let's stop right here because I can't go any better but down. But
Let's
anyway.
stop right here.
So,
Bob, thank you so much. And that's such a kind introduction. And, life is a journey, and success is not necessarily where you go, but the adventure that you take getting there. I didn't start out trying to have a remarkable life journey. I just wanted to be a doctor after being burned when I was 15. And I didn't have a pathway to get there. So my dad was enlisted Air Force, career Air Force, worked extra jobs on the weekend. My mom worked, had a GED, and there just wasn't an avenue. So I had to create a pathway, and that pathway meant that I ended up leaving home at 16, enlisting when I was 18, uh, becoming a nurse, getting a master's in education. I just kept working and going to school, and I had fun as I did it. So it didn't seem like it was a chore. It seemed like it was fun and adventure, and you had failings and you had successes, and you found people that supported you and believed in your dream. And I'm forever grateful to those individuals that did that. But I always remember my father's face on orientation to medical school. And he just looks at me and then he starts laughing. And my dad rarely laughed. And he said, I can't believe you got into medical school and you never graduated high school. So there you go. So I don't know if you want someone who never graduated high school to be chair of the Conservative Climate Caucus, but I think John was also delusional when he asked me to be the chair. He is extraordinarily difficult shoes to fill. And, this was his vision, and it's his baby. And to be entrusted with that, I think is a heavy responsibility. And he's done a good job. One of the things that we focus on our members is how to talk about climate and the environment and energy, which they're all intertwined. And to, not to be embarrassed for what we've done or what we believe. So I don't get into discussions with people on climate change or the reality of climate change or the science or the IPCC. For me, it's a very simple overarching principle, which it gives us a foundation from which to build and to solve problems. And that is, we all want to leave a cleaner, healthier planet to our children and grandchildren, but we have to be able to compete economically around the globe. To do that, the United States has to have affordable, abundant, reliable, secure energy. We know that the policies of this administration create energy poverty. It is a reality that over 600,000 people die annually globally from temperature. The majority of those, over 450,000, from cold. That's a reality. We know that affordable energy saves lives, that the fracking revolution has, since 2005 until now, saved 11,000 American lives per year. And that U.S. natural gas is 40% cleaner than any other place in the world. So if you really are concerned about emissions and air pollution and the climate, you should be promoting U.S. natural gas, both in the United States and for exports abroad. And there are countries who want our U.S. natural gas, rather than allowing China to make inroads into Africa, into South America, by building coal-fired plants and or forcing African countries to use much more carbon-intensive sources of energy rather than helping them with their energy needs. So I think that's my overall arching principle. It's how we're able to retain members. We want to continue to grow the caucus. We want to continue to help with messaging. I think if the Republican Party doesn't have some messaging on climate and the environment and energy, on all of those three topics as they're intertwined, that our ability to go forward and maintain majorities and put forth common sense, pragmatic policy to talk about innovation, improvisation, the things that America does the best, I think that we won't be able to lead in that space. So it's very critically important for us to be engaged.
Yeah, Representative Miller-Meeks, you just said something that I think is really important to pick up on. I heard, and if I'll have the audacity to ask the first question here in this town hall meeting. There was a conservative commentator I heard recently, heard of. So I wasn't there, so I won't name him, but he said something very similar to what you just said. Somebody was at a gathering and challenged this guy, a very conservative fella, about with the normal climate disputation stuff. And he said, "How long you plan on getting elected?" And he basically then went on to say what you just said, which was, if you plan on leading into the future, you better be ready to address this. Is that what you're? I thought just is that how you see this, and why you got so interested in climate? Because you see this as this thing that is going to be an issue. And if the Republican Party isn't in a position to have an answer, then we're sort of relegated to some past where people say, well, you're not helping me now. Is that
Yeah,
where you want to
it was
take
a
the
couple of
caucus?
reasons. One is that I was the token female veteran at my nephew's elementary school. So as they went through elementary, my three nephews in Connecticut, and so they desperately wanted a female veteran. So every single year on Veterans Day, I was invited to go be the female veteran. They didn't say that, but I was the only female veteran. And so I would see all the stuff on the walls about climate and the environment and what young people were being taught. And I'm not going to say whether it's right or wrong. It is not a judgment on the content or whether it should be. It's just a reflection as I'm watching this. And then, you know, I'm a scientist, I'm a doctor. So the science was interesting to me. And I just remember prior to Michael Crichton's death, and Michael Crichton's this amazing doctor scientist. And prior to his death, he had published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that science isn't consensus. And I think people forget that. They think when a whole bunch of scientists or researchers all agree on something, that the science is settled and that's science. That's not science. Science is a hypothesis. You have to put together a research plan, conduct an experiment, get the results from the experiment, and then you have to validate them. And then it becomes science. They have to be replicated. And when it comes to climate science, we've moved away from that. And so that has led to, the Republicans on their side, it was refuting the climate science, what was published. And then on the Democrat side, talking about the climate, and anybody who didn't believe what they believed was climate deniers. And so very much like COVID, we need to be engaged in discussion. We should have discussion. We shouldn't be accusing anybody of, nefarious things. But I think it's very important that we have discussion, we have debate, we have the ability to interact and interchange. But I just saw, to me, there was only one point of view, and there's a vacuum. And so if we're not engaged in that space and all we're doing is arguing about whether or not climate change is real, we miss the most important thing, which is the opportunities to solve problems. So how do we get affordable energy? How do we, prevent energy poverty when we have policies that are forcing wind and solar? These are all important questions. And I came from a state, so I was in a state where 50% of our energy is renewable. At the time, 50% of our electricity was from wind. Now it's 60%. And we're a net exporter of energy. People don't think of Iowa as an energy state. But since I've come to Congress, I've just said Iowa's an energy state. When I was elected to the state Senate in 2018, I actually talked about climate and the environment. And people would ask me, well, do you believe in this? And I go, this is what I believe, which is exactly the principle I espoused to you all, because it takes the focus away from adversarial science, which I don't think it's settled, to really, how can we reduce emissions? The goal should be to reduce emissions, to get the cleanest, healthiest environment we can, but to do that in a way that allows us to have affordable, abundant energy. Energy demand is not going down. I went to my first COP in 2021 with a lot of pushback and chagrin by everybody on my team, but I still went. And the reason I went is that we need to be in that space. So I have an agricultural state. So policies that are geared towards methane from animal emissions, those can be problematic. And no one knows of the work that Cargill is doing in developing feed sources and feed that will reduce emissions. Good sources of protein, having affordable meat for individuals, being able to export that. So it was very important to my state. Biofuels, liquid fuels are important context for development as a renewable source. And we sometimes lose the perspective that renewable isn't only wind and solar. Renewable is all of the gamut of renewable and organic. So whether that's ethanol, biodiesel, biomass, biofuel, compressed renewable natural gas, I'm working on biochar, geothermal, hydropower. We have states that are trying to shut down dams on the Snake River, which hydropower, very clean. Vietnam right now is having an issue because they're wanting to attract tech businesses, but their energy is not as consistent as it used to be because the Chinese Communist Party is blocking, putting dams up on the Mekong River, and they're 50% hydropower. So last year they had less rainfall and the damming of the river. So they had inconsistent power and energy. They want the United States renewable natural gas. And then we have renewable natural gas as well as natural gas. So I think carbon-based fuels, every life structure is based from carbon. And so I think what we should be focused on is reducing the emissions agnostic of the energy source and make the energy sources as clean as possible.
I think you're muted, Bob.
I have my mute on now. I'm unmuted. Yeah, so interesting to hear from a scientist who, an ophthalmologist who helps us to understand these things. And Dr. Miller-Meeks, I think that Angela is going to now facilitate some questions. And Angela may start with some people directly on the republicEn team, but we want to certainly get to the folks in the chat, right, Angela? So I'll hand it to you.
Yeah,
I'll try to talk briefly.
Thank you. So I'd like to turn it over to our Director of Editorial Content, Chelsea Henderson. She's got a question for the representative.
Hi, good morning, Congresswoman. Thank you so much for being on our webinar. When I think of Iowa, I think of the Iowa State Farm, oh my God, I totally blanked on your big festival, farm festival that you have every year. State Fair. I was like, it's not a State Farm. State Farm is insurance.
It's a State Fair.
Right. State Fair. Thank you. Which makes me think of ag. So I feel like the agricultural community is a constituency that has been really hard to talk about climate change with. So coming from a state like Iowa, what is your recommendation for how groups like ours can productively engage in a conversation about climate change?
Well, it's really interesting because we have one of our farmers in my district that goes to COP and has a closed loop operation for farming. So he raises cattle, and he also does row crops, which mean soy and corn. He uses the manure to fertilize, and so it goes through a digester. It creates energy and electricity, and then there's also a thermal component which he's now reutilizing. And so all of this goes in a closed loop operation in his farm. Just this week on Monday, prior to coming back to DC, I was at the Topsoil Summit. This is with Mitchell Hora of Continuing Ag. And so Mitchell Hora is a sustainable regenerative ag, precision agriculture, very much is helping farmers to look into carbon credits, very interested in the IRA tax credits, especially the 45Z. And I always say, there are tax credits as related to climate and energy in the IRA that Republicans would have supported. They just weren't going to support the entire bill with 87,000 IRS agents and Medicare price negotiation for drugs, which is already leading to problems and is going to lead to very high premiums in about 3 or 4 months. So I think there are farmers who are in this space who are already doing things, and it's just showing farmers the benefit. Right now, I don't know if you all know, but the profit margins in agriculture, when you're seeing food prices that are high, that doesn't translate back to the farmers. So they do a very difficult job, very tough work, often have another job, and they don't make much money. When corn is about $4.36 right now. When corn gets close to $4, that's bankruptcy time. Soy is down from 14 and 12, getting down toward 8. So these are very problematic. We know with the Chinese Communist Party building bridges, roads, and train in Brazil will be able to compete because they have lower labor cost. So they'll be able to compete. So I think for farmers, it's helping them to make the case economically. And so carbon credits are one of those things that are valuable to farmers, but they need assistance with that. John Deere, Case, all the implement manufacturers, Kinsey, are all doing work that will help farmers to know what their yield is going to be in their field, how much pesticide, fungicide, fertilizer. And why is that important? If you can reduce the input cost to farmers, that helps them to survive. So I think to approach farmers, they're common sense. They are based in science. Especially a lot of the young farmers, but even farmers in their 50s, all have degrees. They're all college educated. Don't treat them like they're dumb farmers, but appeal to their economic sense. Farmers are they're the first stewards of the land and the climate, the environment. They have to protect the environment or they're unable to farm. They've learned that lesson from the Great Depression and from what happened in the farming crisis and then the farming crisis in the 80s. And so I think appeal to them economically and how it benefits them economically. They're very aware of the sustainability requirements of major corporations and how they play into that. They're very aware. We have Chevron has purchased Renewable Energy Group in Iowa. So they know that the low carbon based fuel for the oil and gas industry is in renewables, ethanol, biodiesel, biomass. They're very aware of that. They know that sustainable aviation fuel is going to come from the renewable sector, marine fuel the same way, because it's very hard to electrify that sector. So I would appeal to their economic sense and how it benefits them. And then there are things that the government could do more of to make it more palatable for cover crops and no-till. But I think these are practices that you will see widely adopted. Farmers and I are working very hard on water quality as well. So I think, to me, that's the way I would approach them.
Thank you.
So now we have our recently joined with us new climate advocacy coordinator, Atticus Edwards. He has a question for the representative.
Hi, Dr. Miller-Meeks. Thanks so much for joining us. So what I would like to know is you've mentioned China's growing international reach a couple of times during this call, and I'm wondering, with that in mind, if you think that reducing carbon emissions can help grow America's international competitive edge.
This is a short answer and 100%. So the next question is, were you named after Atticus Finch?
I'm afraid so. That's right. That's right on the money, ma'am.
I actually think it will. So I think one of the things that's challenging, for Republicans, if they, for those that think climate change is a hoax, or for those who don't believe in it, or who think that, the hockey stick, that wasn't based on actual scientific data. We don't have enough data. We're ignoring a lot of reasons why we may have warming and why climate is changing. So, for those Republicans to be able to do that, one of the things that I reinforce to them is that regardless of what we may individually think, the fact is the world is moving in a certain direction. Companies, especially international companies, they have different stressors and, different, I'm trying to think of the right word and I can't think of it right now, different metric points that they have to meet, and they have sustainability goals. So if we don't want to play in that sector, then they're going to go elsewhere. So I think it is very important for the U.S. to be engaged. I think it's important for us to be engaged as a party. One of the things that we will be doing in the Conservative Climate Caucus is actually looking at the IRA and those tax credits. Typically, Republicans are for tax credits. So which ones are the ones that you keep? How do we keep those? I think the 45s, that segment of tax credits, very important to agriculture. And then the next thing is also going to be on nuclear, where we are. It was interesting, COP26 in 2021, there was only two displays for nuclear. And I think what happened with Russia invading Ukraine, people rapidly saw that we've always known that renewables such as wind and solar didn't have dispatchable base load. They weren't continual, that they're part of the solution, but they're not the only solution. We've always known that. The Ukraine war showed us that. That, you have to have other sources of a continual base load. So whether that's nuclear, whether that's biofuels or other renewables, hydro, geothermal, that we need to look at any of the above and then work on reducing emissions rather than saying rather than subsidizing a preferential industry. And I think for Republicans, that's a message that works very well with them. But I absolutely think that we need to be involved in this because companies will go elsewhere, and that will be to the detriment to the U.S. and to the people, to Americans.
Thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer, Representative.
So the next question is actually my own. Here at republicEn, we believe that to have durable, long-lasting climate policy, that we need to be all working together and working across the aisle towards bipartisanship. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that, and maybe you can share with us some ways that you already are working across the aisle.
So I don't disagree with that. And, first and foremost, one thing is to stop accusing each other and the other side. So when we have, members in the Senate or people at universities who accuse other people of being climate deniers, that doesn't help us to bridge that gap. And it's one of the reasons why focusing on solutions and solving the problem is actually much more productive than arguing over stuff that you may or may not agree with. So it's like working to find where the consensus is. And I think having been a director of public health brings people together, they convene people, and they help to find a roadmap through a problem. So first and foremost, we've got to stop accusing one another and trying to determine what people's motives and their motivation is when we don't know. Secondly, is that we're already doing bipartisan work. So working with Scott Peters, was just working with Ed Case. So finding people with whom you can find common ground. And then the third thing is what would really help right now is if so in the debt limit negotiations, we got permitting reform. Now, it doesn't matter where you are in climate and energy, we have to have permitting reform in this country. Liability reform, permitting reform. So it doesn't matter. If you want to build wind turbines, solar panels, you have to have permitting reform. There's just no two ways about it. You want to build transmission lines. We know our grid infrastructure is not adequate. Number one, it's not adequate for the increasing demands. Number two, we have to be very aware of what's happening with data centers and tech. Data centers will absorb more energy than an entire city. I mean, it's huge the amount of energy that they consume, and they're not going to decrease; they're going to increase especially as we go into AI, which is another huge, energy sink. So we're going to need to have permitting reform. President Biden, so the Senate Democrats agreed to permitting reform in the FRA in the debt limit negotiations. President Biden signed it, but now he's not wanting to implement the permitting reform that he signed on to. It would go a long way for Republicans if they were honest brokers and did what they agreed to do. So those are small little things. And that's one of the things that you all can help do is, talk with members on the other side of the aisle, talk with the administration. Look, permitting reform is important. It's important for these things, but it's also important for these. Let's be fair about this and not use permitting reform only for our favored industries. Let's do broad-based permitting reform. So I think those are three ways that we can work together. And the next is that Democrats need the IRA, and it's in jeopardy. So there's, we have 6 more months to the end of the year. They have a lot of money that has not gone out the door because of the constraints that they put on it. And they're going to need Republicans to help with the IRA, and they're going to need the Conservative Climate Caucus to do that as well. So the more they can be honest brokers in what they've already agreed to, especially in permitting reform, I think that that's helpful. I think there is more broad-based recognition of the need for nuclear. And, blue states are looking at perhaps they shouldn't be, taking down the dams for hydropower as it's a source of clean, renewable energy. So I think there are a lot of things that we can agree on, focus on where we agree, be honest brokers, continue to work together. And one of the easiest ways to do that is on permitting reform.
Thank you. I really appreciate the effort or your answer. And I want to personally say that as a woman, having you in this spot is incredibly encouraging.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure. Again, John Curtis has big shoes to fill. I'm a person who believes very strongly in merit. So I'm not the smartest person. I just work a lot harder than a lot of people.
Well, thank you. So let's move on to some of the comments that are coming through the chat. And a lot of the first comments are some things that you've already touched on. Anita Christensen, though, she wanted to know about funding. Like, where does the funding come from for emission reduction projects?
Well, first and foremost, I think that we're giving short shrift to companies. So people are going to follow the funding streams and the credits in the IRA, the money that's in the IRA. That's easy money. They're going to do that. But the problem with that is that it may actually skew us and deter us from other things that would work. So there's a lot of entrepreneurialness. There's a lot of innovation. There's tech that will help in this too. As we know, when we talk about a smart grid, there's innovations in the tech sector and AI that are going to be able to help us with energy as well. But part of this is we know that we've got 35 trillion in debt, but we also know that there are smart investments. So that requires us as lawmakers to prioritize spending. So, and I can just, one of those examples would be the 1.9 trillion on COVID spending as we were already out of the pandemic. Maybe that wasn't a great use of, spending government money, deficit spending government money, which led to the high prices, because that then creates issues for trying to do the things we're doing because they cost much more. I think one of the best ways to get more funding is to grow the economy. So you'll hear on the Republican side cutting spending. I continue to hammer the point home to leadership and in every committee or caucus group I'm in that there are two ways to cut the national debt, which is absolutely a problem. It is a national security threat, but there's two ways to do that. One is to cut spending, which is the only thing you talk about. The other is to grow the economy. How can we grow the economy? Regulatory reform, very important. We have an EPA that is on regulatory overdrive. They don't look at the number of vehicles on the road when they put forth a tailpipe emission rule that says 67% of the vehicles need to be electric in 8 years. Where does that electricity come from? How much is that demand going to be? How are we going to be able to do that if we're shutting down, gas-fired plants? So those kinds of things, I think, in the regulatory space, we can do a lot that don't make people unsafe, don't reduce quality of life, don't threaten our environment or the inroads that we have made, but actually will help grow the economy. Growing the economy, competing to be able to compete globally. I think that's the biggest way we can increase the revenue to the Treasury, which then allows us, instead of trying to divide the pie and making it a finite pie, grow the pie and then divide the pie. And I think Bob would agree with that.
Yeah.
Yes, I would. And it really is. You get a much bigger fight when you think that there's a limited pie. If you think the pie is going to grow, you can have a lot of cooperation, can't you?
Yeah. So we need to talk about growing the economy, which is one of the reasons that's in the principles I elucidated earlier. But growing the economy allows us to, and then you prioritize where your spending is. We don't have to favor industries. I mean, people remember under the Obama administration, they remember the Solyndras. Right now, the Chinese Communist Party is benefiting from the tax cuts or the tax credits that are in the IRA. That is tremendously problematic. We should not be benefiting our greatest adversary, who we know economically wants to, take down the United States. So, the policies we put in place should be policies that are going to help, number one, our climate here in the United States, our environment, two, globally, and then three, that allows us to continue to be in a position of influence and to grow jobs, increase take-home pay for individuals here in the United States.
So Larry Lennon-Schmidt is asking, do you think a carbon fee and dividend plan is feasible in the current Congress?
I don't think it's feasible in the current Congress, and I think we still have a lot of work to do. So, we need to have international, just like there's international accounting standards, we need to have international standards as and not geared by Europe. We know, and again, I'm going to say the Chinese Communist Party because we've got a China Select subcommittee as well, but we know that they skirt the rules. I just know that from Iowa, from working in the agricultural sector, that they skirt the rules when it comes to solar panels, how they're sourced, where they're made, in order to avoid certain constraints. We know that China and India are the largest emitters of pollution, but they're not in any of the accords or agreements. But nonetheless, I think that we have, opportunities in order to be able to both compete and to reduce emissions, but we have to be, pragmatic about what we can do. When we're looking at carbon taxes, where does that money go to? Quite honestly, I don't trust the federal government that it would go back to individuals and help individuals. So, I'll apologize for that up front, but I just don't trust the federal government with that revenue stream to be able to do that. In addition to which, whatever happens has to be fair to the United States. And so if other countries are allowed to have a carbon score that's lower because they're avoiding the mechanisms and skirting the rules, that's not fair to us in the United States. So I don't see it happening this Congress, because we end in 6 months. I don't see it happening in this Congress, but it doesn't mean that we don't continue those conversations.
Heatherington asks, how big of an obstacle is climate misinformation? And what can be done to address it?
I think first and foremost is always to be honest. And that is, when we know things that are true facts, not hypothesized facts, that we're able to do that. That we don't ignore things because they're perhaps outside of our belief system. And then I would always say, be gentle and be kind. You will gain more by being kind than you will by being, there's a time to be assertive and there's a time to be in your face. That's not always the case that you have to be. But I think that you can guide more people now. And I say that at a time when we just had a hearing this week with Dr. Fauci on COVID. And what has been revealed was what people like me were saying from 2020 on, and we were being censored and deplatformed and stigmatized. I had threats to my license with people complaining to the Board of Medicine in Iowa. And now it comes out that, well, we didn't have any science. We kept telling you to follow the science, but we didn't have any science for what we did. So I'm going to relay that when I say be kind. And things that that are truly factual and not consensus. Again, science isn't consensus. I think there is so much that we don't know about climate and the environment. There is so much that we don't know about weather. And we don't have this long continuum. The data we have is in the whole scheme of the world, the globe, the earth. The data we have is really very short. It's a short time period when you look at the millions of years the earth has been here. And so, people were ignoring the effect of the sun and solar flares. That has a huge effect on warming. So I think when I say be certain of your facts, they should be facts. And then science always should have the ability to question, to debate, to interact without people being blamed or stigmatized or canceled or deplatformed or censored. And the one highlight I will give on that is peptic ulcer disease. So I was a nurse taking care of people. We were removing parts of people's stomach, and it was all thought that peptic ulcer disease came from type A personalities, obsessive compulsive perfectionistics. And if we did behavior modification or had people go to different jobs, that we would end peptic ulcer disease. And you had 2 scientist doctors in Australia who kept hammering home that it was a bacteria. It took over 20 years for the medical community to finally acknowledge that they were correct. And now we know it's Helicobacter pylori. That's what I mean by we have to have this interchange. And it's why Republicans need to be in this space. We provide a different perspective, one that's more common sense, one that's more pragmatic, and one that is less ideological, understanding the needs of people and how forcing certain climate policies actually hurts the most vulnerable and the people in the most disadvantaged communities and countries that are trying to grow an economy. I mean, think about it. If we're forcing certain energy policies on certain worlds, and I've said this at the past 2 COPs, energy isn't just energy. It's clean water. It's septic. It's the ability to get basic health care. And most importantly, It's the ability to have electricity at night that allows you to grow your intellectual capital. And these are very important. These things are just as important as anything else we talk about in climate and the environment and energy.
Larry Howe, he wants to know if the Conservative Climate Caucus has had an MIT En-ROADS Climate Solution Simulator presentation, which I believe you guys have.
So, there's a lot of great work that's being done at MIT. And so the current makeup under my leadership has not. But one of the things that we want to do with the Conservative Climate Caucus is actually bring in groups, whether we go away for a meeting or we bring people into Washington, D.C., but to get this experience, meeting the different groups, meeting who's in the space, whether they're, private businesses, educational, nonprofits. I think people need to know who's in this, I don't want to say environment, but who's in this environment or space, and get to know them. For me, it was like meeting people individually piecemeal, and it's hard to put the whole thing together. But I think that's one of the things that we want to focus on and do. I think Speaker McCarthy, when he was speaker, he had a great idea. He actually wanted to have a course from MIT for members of Congress, both sides of the aisle, which, when we're having to make legislation on AI, quantum, there's so much science stuff that we're doing legislation on, and we don't know the information. We don't have the foundation. I thought it was a great idea. So we will be redoing that because it's part of this foundation of helping us to create the best policy possible.
That if I could jump in there, Angela, and just say, well, the neat thing about that MIT En-ROADS thing is you could run it as a competition. I've actually done that before with Drew Jones, the guy that developed it, the model. It's really pretty cool, and it'd be fun, especially if you could challenge some Democrats to get in the competition. In other words,
Bob, after just coming off my primary, I want no competitions.
Yeah, that's true. But the thing is, it's interesting. Some people, like you say, go along with some theories or ideas, and then they don't prove out. And so if you get into that MIT simulation, it's pretty amazing how you can actually do policy and then see what happens with emissions. It's pretty cool. And so I'm with Larry Howe on that it's a pretty cool way to do it. And a fun way to do it is you do it as a competition.
So that's something we need to look at.
Back to you, Angela.
Thanks. So I apologize if I butcher this name, but Alicio Santana, he asks, do you agree that solar power installation at the level of individual homes is the pathway to energy independence? We need to become the world's technology leader.
So I think that's a great question, and I'm going to thank you for that question. So in Iowa, we probably not as much as California or Hawaii, but we do have home-based solar. And so I sometimes will say we need the democratization of utility and energy. And so what I mean by that is if you're generating and we actually had a couple of bills on this in the state Senate. If you're generating your own electricity and you want to sell it back to the grid, how do you do that? And then who pays for the poles, lines, and transformers? It can't only be the energy company if they're paying people back. And then how do you even out the distribution of energy, and when you have peaks and when you have valleys and when you get energy, which translates to also to our grid, our electric grid system. When electrons are traveling both ways, that increases the stress on our transmission lines and our grid system. So I think that that's a fascinating topic. I think that is going to be part of how we solve energy and how we solve demand is from personal energy use. I know when we built a home, we have a home on 50 acres, as well as I have a residence in Davenport. When I built it, I sited the home so that I love the sunlight. I love a lot of light in my house. So I situated the house so that we got a lot of natural sunlight. My energy cost in this house, that's 3 times bigger than the house I had before, which didn't have as much insulation. I did 2x6 wall construction, windows. So my energy costs in the winter are 1/3 of what they were. in a house that was a third of the size. And so I think all of these siding, how you site houses, what you do with windows, what you do with insulation and solar panels, I absolutely think that all of that is part of this process. I love when I'm on the roadway and I see that lights or displays and panels or road construction is powered by a solar panel. You know, years ago, I was thinking, well, we ought to have little solar panel films on women's purses or backpacks. So you just plug your phone in and that's how you charge your phone. So I think there's a lot we can do, and we haven't even thought of all of the possibilities of what we can do with energy to both meet the energy demand, have personal energy self-generation. And I do think that that's part of the solution. But there also comes, you know, you're going to have to work with utility companies on how do we price that? How do we sell back? And then I will give you another example is that we have an Iowa 80 truck stop. It's a very large truck stop. And they put in, I think a decade ago, a lot of charging stations for electric vehicles, but they're not allowed to charge for the electricity. So they pay for the electricity, but they can't charge the car for the electricity. So how do we do that? What do we do policy-wise? You know, how do we make that viable? We want them to put in charging stations, but how do we make that viable for them to do it? Because they're very costly and they have a very short lifespan. So I think that's a great question. I love that question. I'd be happy to work with you on it.
All right, so I'm scrolling through these questions here, looking for something that maybe we haven't already touched on. There's one though that sort of caught my eye, and there's probably an interesting story behind it. But Steve Matter asks, why do you think President Reagan removed the solar panels that President Carter attached to the White House?
I have no idea.
Yeah, I just.
But why do you think he did?
I imagine that was a really long time ago, and solar energy back then was sort of new technology. I don't.
He may have thought it disrupted the aesthetics of the White House. I mean, that can certainly, given what I know of President Reagan, I would say that would be the most likely thing. I don't think it was necessarily animosity towards, I mean, that would happen now, but I don't think it was necessarily animosity towards President Carter. You know, there may have been more upkeep. I have no idea. So I can't answer that question, but if you find the answer, that would be interesting to learn.
That was solar hot water, not solar photovoltaic. So that was, I think, there was more maintenance and upkeep with it.
Oh, interesting. You know, Mariannette, something interesting about what you just said is that would be then, not now, not then. I think that's so true, you know, because you think about the way that Reagan spoke. You know, I'm a huge fan of his, you know, and he once said, so much what the liberals know just isn't so. You know, which is a very polite way of disagreeing with them. Now, what we'd say is they're liars, they're terrible, whatever, you know. Is there any way out of that, you think? I mean, am I like a throwback to some previous age wanting to live with Reagan, say so much of what they know just isn't so, you know, which is a very polite way to put it.
Well, I think that gets to the culture and social media and the role of anonymity in how we interact with individuals. And I think there are, you know, a great many people who are much more comfortable communicating electronically and don't know how to communicate when they're face to face. And that's one of the things that we have to get back to in our school system, our education system, and as parents, is how to help people to communicate, interact with one another, how to do that politely. I think the coarsening of our society, we see that every single day. We see that in airplanes. You see it out in public. You see it at restaurants and, you know, fast food restaurants, you know, upscale restaurants. This idea of, you know, being polite, being respectful, and engaging in a conversation. So yes, I think that there's a coarsening. You know, I don't talk a lot about how bipartisan I am, especially not in the primary. But we know that the work we do in Congress, unless you have huge, big majorities, and that's problematic in and of itself, because the public doesn't accept things as readily when it's done only one-sided. And so I think it behooves us. I'm in a swing district, so for me, it's kind of a natural tact that I'm trying to represent the district as a whole, not just my party. So I just think that, having this idea that I don't gauge people's motivation, because I don't know what their motivation is. I can guess at it. I can try to figure out what it is. All I can do is determine, what they did, what they didn't do, what they said, and then go from that standpoint. But I do think that there's a course in it, and I think social media has a role to play in that, because people can be anonymous or assume different identities. And then they forget that they're no longer on social media and anonymous when they're face-to-face with individuals, and they continue that behavior over. But huge fan of President Reagan. Is continues to be my favorite president. My oldest brother of the 8 kids, he had gone into the Army at 18, and then worked in the coal mines in Pennsylvania, then became a Secret Service agent, and ultimately ended up being the bodyguard for Carter, Ford, Reagan, Bush, and then Reagan and San Rancho Mirage. And my parents and younger sister went out to meet with President Reagan, and I was stupid and in medical school and said, no, I can't have the time. And I regret that, not having met President Reagan, but he was an amazing, amazing president.
So we are at we've got about 5 minutes left here before we need to say goodbye to Representative Mariannette Miller-Meeks and close out. I'm going to ask this question here from Greg Jason. How would you describe the role of the federal government to enable emissions reduction while ensuring an affordable supply of energy?
Well, that's actually the $100 million question. Is how does the federal government enable decreased transmission, help to have a cleaner environment, but have affordable energy? And that's the problem, is that we haven't seen that. When we had Administrator Regan of the EPA in, I asked him a very simple question, and it was about the power plant rule and about the tailpipe emissions rule. And I asked him how many vehicles were on the road in the US today. And I asked this question a year ago. So he didn't know the answer a year ago, and he doesn't know the answer now. And then my second question was, how much electricity, energy does it take to get a single 100-mile charge? And the government's definition of passenger vehicles are passenger sedans, light trucks, and motorcycles. He didn't know the answer to that question a year ago, and he didn't know the answer to that question now. Now, I don't expect agency head or secretary to know everything. I don't know everything. But I do expect them, if they're going to make a policy to direct that 66% of vehicles on the road be electric in 8 years, that they have an idea of what that means and how to get there, that they have a plan. So if you don't know the number of vehicles on the road, and you don't know how much energy it takes, how can you make a rule mandating that this occur? How are you going to implement that? Who's punished? Who's hurt? And I just think that there's a lack of that responsiveness. What I want to see from the federal government is, if you want to put forth policies, number one, have a strategy. We don't have an energy strategy in this country. We have a bill that says we want this, we're going to support these industries, we're going to give these tax credits, but we don't have a strategy of how we get from A to how we get to B, and how we hurt the least number of people. I'm going to go back to what I said when I started. We have to have affordable energy. We cannot compete economically if we have 40 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity as they do in Germany. We can't. It has to be abundant. Energy demand is going up. It is not going down. And the tech industry and industries that we want to see to grow, especially in AI, will require much more energy. Number three, It has to be reliable. That means you have to have a continuous base load. How are you going to get that continuous base load? And part of our energy strategy and what the government should be talking about is how they facilitate that, not how they take things offline and put us in an energy deficit and increase energy poverty. Because who's going to be the most hurt? It's not going to be Al Gore. It's going to be average, ordinary, working Iowans and Americans that can't afford high energy prices that are going to be the most hurt. It's going to be entrepreneurs and small businesses that create all of the big businesses that are going to be the most hurt. And so that's what I expect the government to do. Let's put forth an energy strategy, willing to help you do that. I don't know all the answers, but I'm willing to engage in the conversation. Let's put forth a plan for how we get from A to B and how we hurt the least number of people in getting to A to B while meeting the goals we want, which is to reduce emissions, to have a cleaner, healthier planet.
All right, well, I'm going to thank Representative Mariannette Miller-Meeks for being here with us today. You've been very engaged, answered some hard questions, I think, and we just couldn't enjoy it more and be more grateful that you spent time with us out of your busy schedule to have this webinar with us.
Well, my pleasure. And, it goes without saying that I think that free markets and the market will help solve this solution if the government and the rest of us will allow them to work. And I mentioned it peripherally, and I think Representative Inglis would fully agree with that comment as well, too. So thank you so much for the introduction, Representative Inglis. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And thank you all for being willing to engage in the conversation.
Thank you.
And if I could just finish with this. On the plaque on the door, I think it says Representative Mariannette Miller-Meeks, Iowa 1. Then it says U.S. Army retired colonel, and then it says MD. That is back to where I started. That is an impressive series of things. And I think everybody on this call joins me in saying, wow, that is an impressive pedigree, but it's also an impressive person we've just heard from. So thank you very much, Mariannette, and look forward to seeing you soon.
All right. Thank you all so much. You have a great weekend.